Hi, and welcome to Communication Accommodation. Here's where we're going. A simple notion becomes a comprehensive communication theory. Communication accommodation strategies. Different motivations for convergence and divergence. Recipient evaluation of convergence and divergence. Applying CAT to a police officer-citizen interaction. Critique. Enormous scope at the cost of clarity. A simple notion becomes a comprehensive communication theory. Giles launched a program of lab and field research on speech accommodation. When don't we adjust our speech style? What is our motive for not accommodating? Is accommodation always conscious? Do others accurately perceive our intent? Do we adjust what we say the way we say it? What social consequences exist for over-accommodating? Giles offered communication accommodation theory, or CAT, as a theory of intercultural communication that actually attends to communication. Accommodation is constant movement toward and away from others by changing communicative behavior. It's also used in an intergenerational context. Communication accommodation strategies. Convergence is a strategy through which you adapt communication behavior to become more similar to another person. We adopt the sound and cadence of the other person. You talk in a way so that it is easier for the other person to grasp what you are saying. You practice discourse management. You satisfy the other person's emotional needs. Divergence is a strategy of insinuating the difference between yourself and another person. It's characterized by divergence from the norm. Self-handicapping is for the elderly a face-saving strategy that invokes age as a reason for not performing well. Cat's view of age-old stereotypes. Hardwood argues that the elderly talk reminds younger listeners that they are old. They talk about age, about health, and they do not understand the world today. It's patronizing. It's a painful self-disclosure. They express difficulty hearing, mental confusion. Maintenance is a part of divergence. Maintenance is persisting in your original communication style regardless of the communication behavior of the other. Over-accommodation is demeaning or patronizing talk. It's excessive concern paid to vocal clarity or amplitude, message simplification, or repetition. Different motivations for convergence and divergence. The desire for social approval is a main motivation for convergence. It does not explain why we frequently communicate in a divergent way. It does not account for the fact that we act as a representative of a group. Social identity is group memberships and social categories that we use to define who we are. Tadgefield and Turner argue for a motivational continuum, with motivational identity on one end of the scale and social identity at the other end. They argue that communication will likely become divergent because of their need to emphasize their distinctiveness. Initial orientation is communicators' predisposition to focus on either their individual identity or group identity during a conversation. Characteristics included in initial orientation include the collectivist cultural context. It's a we-centered focus that emphasizes similarity and mutual concern within the culture. Communication to the out-group is often divergent. Initial orientation also includes a distressing history of interaction. If previous interaction is uncomfortable, competitive, or hostile, Both interactants will tend to ascribe the outcome to the other person's social identity. Initial orientation also includes stereotypes. The more specific and negative images people have of an outgroup, the more likely they are to think in terms of social identity and resort to divergent communication. There are norms for the treatment of groups. Norms are expectations about behavior that members of a community should or should not occur in particular situations. High group solidarity and high group dependence. Communicators have an initial intergroup orientation when they have strong identification with the group and high dependence on it for relational warmth and sense of worth. Recipient evaluation of convergence and divergence. Listeners regard convergence as positive and divergence as negative. It is not important how the communicator converged or diverged, but how the other perceived the communicator's behavior. Objective versus subjective accommodation. There's a disconnect between what researchers observed and what participants heard and saw. Giles argues that one does not converge towards or diverge from the actual speech of the recipient, but toward, in other words, from, one stereotype about the recipient's speech. Attribution theory suggests that our response to others' communication hinges on the behavior we perceive and the intention or motive we ascribe to them for speaking that way. Attribution is a perceptual process by which we observe what people do and then try to figure out their intent or disposition. Listeners who interpret convergence as a speaker's desire to break down cultural barriers react favorably. There are benefits and costs to both convergent and divergent strategies. Applying CAT to police officer-citizen interaction. Giles argues that police stops for possible driving infractions are potentially negatively valenced, emotionally charged interactions. The police are trained to stay on guard. Giles studied 313 randomly selected video recordings of traffic stops in Cincinnati, Ohio. Interracial interactions were less accommodating than stops where the officer and the driver were of the same race. The accommodating civilians may be less susceptible to harsh penalties and reprimands. Critique: enormous scope at the cost of clarity. Communication accommodation theory morphed into a theory of enormous scope. It does meet the criteria of explanation of the data. Communication accommodation theory describes communication behavior and explains why it happens. Giles does not shy away from forecasting what will happen in specific situations. With regard to relative simplicity, the structure and underlying terminology of this theory are not always represented consistently in texts and propositions. In reference to the testable hypothesis, the theory as a whole probably cannot be tested at one time. In this theory's use of quantitative research, the studies using surveys and interviews are the norm, and experiments are rare. In reference to the value of practical utility, the application of this theory to intergenerational communication demonstrates usefulness. So to review our discussion of communication accommodation theory, we discussed a simple notion becomes a comprehensive communication theory, communication accommodation strategies, different motivations for convergence and divergence, recipient evaluation of convergence and divergence, applying CAT to police officer-citizen interactions, and we ended with critique, enormous scope at the cost of clarity.